Hi everyone, this is Chris, and I'm here to go over some basic terminology for marine biology. So I'm going to start with terminology for different groups of living organisms, sort of the broad general groups that we use to describe where different organisms live in the oceans. And then I'm going to talk about the different zones of the oceans. There are lots of these different zones, and most of them are sort of contrasting to another zone. And hopefully this will help us get a common language to talk about marine biology. So first off, I'm going to talk about the plankton and make sure that my fill-in is showing. And so the plankton are drifters or wanderers. This word plankton comes from the Greek for drifters or wanderers. And these are organisms with little or no ability to swim. Some of them might be able to swim a little bit, but generally they're at the mercy of the currents. And this includes viruses, prokaryotes, protists, small animals and larvae, as well as larger animals like jellyfish and salps that can't really move against the current. Next, we have the nekton, which are the swimmers. These are larger organisms that can really fight the current, fish, marine mammals, squid, things like that. Next, we have neuston, or sometimes they're called pleuston, which are organisms that live at the air-water interface. And so this can include microorganisms, but also animals like Portuguese man-o-war and flying fish. And in some cases, these would also have different descriptions. So Portuguese man-o-war are neuston, but they're also plankton, whereas flying fish are neuston, but they are also nekton, they can swim. So those are sort of what we call animals in the water column, generally speaking. And then we have the benthos. So the benthos are organisms that live near, on, or in the bottom of the ocean. And this also applies to lakes, rivers, and streams as well. And so we can break the benthos up further into a few groups. So first we have the infauna, which are the animals or fauna that live within the sediment. Mostly filter feeders and deposit feeders. This could be worms and clams and things like that. And then we have epifauna, which are the animals and organisms that live on top of, that's what that prefix epi means, is on top of the sediment. And so this mostly includes mobile grazers like sea urchins or predators like crabs and sea stars. Finally, we have this term demersal, which is mostly applied to fish, but might also be applied to cephalopods that live near the bottom and swim near the bottom. This is a little complicated because they might also be described as nectonic or even pelagic. So for example, some fish like Atlantic cod generally live near the bottom, so they're demersal, but at times they're found up in the water column, so they're considered pelagic, and that's a term we'll get to in a moment. So next we can start talking about different zones of the ocean. So we'll start with the intertidal. And the intertidal is simply the area between the low tide, or the low tide, and the high tide. The tide lines vary over the course of the month, depending on the position of the moon, which is something we'll talk about later on. And so this is an interesting area because organisms in this area have to deal with being exposed to the air part of the time, right, at low tide, and then submerged the other part of the time during high tide. Next, we have the subtidal. And so this is areas that are always or almost always underwater. They may be exposed briefly during really low tides, right, spring tides when we have full or new moons, but most of the time they're underwater. Next, we have the littoral zone, and this term is often used interchangeably with intertidal, but it can mean the nearshore area more generally and more broadly. Literally, it means shore. So sometimes the littoral zone might also include some of the subtidal. Then we have the supralittoral zone. This is also called the splash or spray zone or supratidal zone. This is an area that's rarely submerged, except maybe during storm surges at high tide, but it's still strongly affected by the ocean. It gets salt deposition. Animals that live on the shoreline may travel between this area and the intertidal, for example. Okay, so, and then going along with that, we also have the sublittoral, which is sort of equivalent to the subtidal, except it usually extends further. So it's usually meant to mean the whole sort of continental slope below the tide line. So subtidal is more usually restricted to near shore, whereas sublittoral is the entire shelf below the tide line. And so that brings the term up. which is the continental shelf. So it's the submerged portion of a continent. So we'll talk more about continental plates and oceanic plates when we talk about plate tectonics. But actually, this is part of the continent, but it's underwater. And so this is generally relatively shallow, usually less than 200 meters deep. And this transitions into the continental slope, where we move from the continental plate to the deeper oceanic plate. And yeah, so it's this transition to the deep ocean. Okay, so we can also talk about the benthic zone, which is the bottom, right? That adjective benthic, benthos, same thing. So we might describe organisms as being benthic, or processes as being benthic. And this contrasts with the pelagic zone, which is basically what we call the water column. So this is the area above the bottom, right, in the open ocean, and again, the pelagic zone. So this is usually contrasted with benthic. Okay, so next, another zone, there are lots of these zones, is the neritic zone. And this is the relatively shallow area of the continental shelf, also called coastal waters. And this is sort of interchangeable with continental shelf. The continental shelf is really usually referring just to like the bottom, like the continent, that part of the continent, whereas the neritic zone is sort of all the waters above and the organisms that live there. So we might refer to some organisms as neritic. They spend their entire life living close to the shore. And we contrast this with oceanic organisms, or the oceanic zone, which is the open, deep ocean. And some organisms may spend their whole lives or most of their lives out in the open ocean. So for example, tuna are rarely found in the neritic zone. They spend most of their lives out in the open ocean. Okay, so another set of zones that have to do with sunlight and light are the photic zone, which I think I've said in class, and you probably have heard me say variously, it's to 200 meters depth or 1,000 meters depth. It sort of depends on what you're counting as a photic zone. So to 200 meters or so, we have light that's usable for photosynthesis. So by one definition, that would be the photic zone, right? The penetration of light is still usable by organisms for photosynthesis. However, there's still light that occurs down to about 1,000 meters, but it's really a low portion of light. So it's detectable, but it's not really good for doing anything. Below that, so sometimes people call this area of sort of low light that's not really usable the dysphotic zone. This is not on our terms list, but this is where you get that sort of variation in 200 or 1,000 meters. What is the bottom of the photic zone? And then below the photic zone or dysphotic zone is the aphotic zone. This is the area of the deep ocean where there's basically no sunlight penetration, or little, depending on whether you're sitting in that mark at 200 or 1,000 meters. No photosynthesis occurs here. So think about what that means for the organisms that live here. Also thinking about depth, we can talk about the really deep ocean, the abyssal zone. This is areas from 4,000 to 6,000 meters. This is sort of the general depth of the open ocean. And plug for the movie The Abyss. It's a sci-fi horror from the late 80s. It's awesome, check it out. But anyway, but it is not the deepest part of the ocean. The deepest part of the ocean is the so-called Hadal zone, right, named after Hades, the Greek underworld. And this is the very, very deep ocean. These are ocean trenches that are greater than 6,000 meters depth. So think the Marianas Trench, Challenger Deep, those are part of the Hadal zone. And then there are two more terms on our terms list that don't really fit nicely into this graphic, so I'm going to put them on their own slide here. And this is the exclusive economic zones, or EEZ, and these are the zones within 200 nautical miles of a country's coastline that it controls. These might also be called territorial waters. So within 200 nautical miles of the United States coast, we control that water, right? We get to say who can build oil rigs there, who can go fishing there. And this is contrasted with the areas beyond anybody's EEZs, which are termed the high seas, or sometimes called international waters, although high seas is the real legal term used. And so these are parts of the ocean that aren't really controlled by anybody. They are governed loosely by the Convention of the High Seas. And by loosely, I mean that there aren't really that many rules, right? Anybody can go fishing there. Anybody can go exploring for minerals there. And this causes problems for a few reasons. People fight over that stuff, right? It's like, well, I want to fish there and you're not allowed to fish there. The other issue is it sort of suffers from the tragedy of the commons, meaning that because nobody owns it, nobody is responsible for it. And so how do you decide what organisms should be protected there? How should they be protected? How would you delineate parks or conservation areas in the high seas? It's a big question for conservation and for marine biologists. Okay, so I think that's it for now. Hopefully this video didn't take too long. If you have questions, as always, feel free to reach out and ask me. Bye.